Boker Tov. Hello to California.
Okay, good morning. Good morning. How was your summer?
It was good. And yours?
Terrific. We had a wonderful celebration. We celebrated 60th anniversary. So we took all the children away for a week.
You were in Scottsdale, right?
Yes. We went to, we had 9 grandchildren and 7 adults and even a couple of boyfriends.
Nice.
It was really wonderful.
That's
And
wonderful.
how do we get rid of this? Let's see. I'm at, okay, there we go. You know, maybe I will go in the other room. Sandy Mazel Tov, you had a bar mitzvah.
Right. Yes, very much. It was enormous pleasure.
Is that the first one?
No. This is the second one where our granddaughter had a bat mitzvah last October at Bris Shalom, and then we have the Orthodox kids, the girls in Baltimore, where in their community the bat mitzvah consists of a party that the girls have. I don't know that there's a rule, but it's generally not in the same zip code as the synagogue. It's a little different. The egalitarianism at Bris Shalom is something that's easier for me to handle.
I hear you. Well, Mazel Tov.
Thank you.
It was a beautiful bar mitzvah, and he did a beautiful job. I watched it on live stream.
Well, thank you. It was. I said to Leslie that afternoon it was a glorious day.
Yep.
It's those days you want a bottle, you know.
Yes, you want to duplicate, but it's a little difficult on the grandchildren to duplicate it.
Yes, a lot.
Hi, Manny.
I'm gonna go close this because it's too.
Okay.
Hi, Bob.
Hello.
Okay. Go. My dog is got to join us too.
All right. He pays the same fee as everybody else.
That's right. Quite often on Minion, he sees the computer on, he hears certain people, and he says, me too.
Me too.
So I let him.
Just don't let us catch him praying.
That's right.
Oh, yes.
It's good to see everybody again. It's good. Nice. So when you guys are out in Scottsdale, you weren't far from my brother.
Really?
Yeah, he lives out there off of Shea.
Oh, we were off of Shea a lot.
Yeah.
You know, when we weren't with the tellers, we went to Chompy's. You've been to Chompy's?
Oh, many times. That's what actually my mom loved that place, so we went there a lot.
Yeah, we love it. So we sneak away when we're not with the tellers. But I have to tell you, there are 5 kosher restaurants in Scottsdale. I was amazed.
Yeah.
And so it was really, really easy for us all. I mean, we brought in a lot and but all from kosher restaurants, and it was terrific. Then we went to one Chabad restaurant that was hopping. It was amazing. So I was very, very surprised because here in San Francisco, which is a big city, we don't have any. We don't have one kosher restaurant.
Yeah, so as I was going to say, Phoenix has actually a larger Jewish population than Houston, but it's far less centralized. It's far less committed. Well, San Francisco is really the ultimate of unaffiliated. As I remember Rabbi Artson saying, the numbers there are about 12% affiliation.
Yeah. He was raised here. He's from San Francisco.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think Houston is about 55%, which is pretty much saturation in terms of American society.
And we have a lot of kosher restaurants.
Yes, we do.
You do, you do. I know whenever we come and visit, we've always got places to go with Vicky and Renan.
Yep. Including a nice steak place.
We have kosher restaurants now, but those of you who remember 20 years ago, there was one.
Oh, yes. Is that one still here?
No.
Okay.
And of course, now you've got so many vegetarian restaurants.
Yeah.
We have a lot of vegan restaurants too. 50 years ago, we had 2 kosher meat markets.
Well,
And now you've got it in the grocery stores.
yeah, growing up here, I remember maybe 4 kosher meat markets. Now there's one that's opened in Fondren Southwest. I don't know how big it is, but other than that, it's HEB in Meyerland or
Yeah,
Randall's Meyer Park.
Or they did what people did in San Francisco. They either drove to where there were kosher restaurant markets. I used to drive to Oakland, or they have it shipped in.
Yeah.
right, exactly.
With my first congregation was in Rockland County, New York, about 3 miles from Muncie. There was nothing you couldn't get. No, it was truly
Wild.
wonderful. Yeah,
Did they have treif restaurants?
yeah. In between, you could find one, right?
And
All right,
that's
my-
a
Nobody
change.
talked about it. They
It
kept
ha-
it under wraps.
Yeah.
All right, my friends, we're going to get started because at 1 o'clock I have a Federation security meeting that I'm going to go to. So I'm feeling a little time bound today because of that. All right, good to see everybody back. It's wonderful, and I'm looking forward to spending there's about 14 weeks in this course. We'll go through right through February, and hopefully we'll have some fun with it. Again, one of the issues, feel free to ask questions. I do this class in person, and oftentimes I'll be able to see an eyebrow raise and I'll say, I see a question. Here it's a little harder for me to do this. So please feel free to just kind of let us know you have a question. Okay. All right. So what we're going to start out is I want to define the time periods we're looking at. Prior to rabbinic time is biblical times. Biblical period is defined as Abraham through Moses, David, Solomon, the destruction of the first temple, the exile, and then the return of many to Israel and the construction of the second temple. Keep in mind that most of the people actually, in terms of the exile, did not come back. The great majority of the population stayed in Babylonia and didn't necessarily come back to Israel for much the same reasons that we are here in America and don't go back to Israel. We've got comfortable lives. We've got family here. We've got connections here. And so many of the Jews stayed in Babylonia. That period concludes with Persian times and was really about 1,000 years in total. The age and the culture designated as rabbinic, and again, none of this is absolute. It's a very, the edges are unclear, extends from approximately the time of Alexander the Great's entrance onto the scene in 330 before the Common Era, and goes approximately to the middle of the 6th century, shortly before the rise of Islam, a period of well over 800 years. So that's the time frame in general of which we're speaking. Okay, 330 before the Common Era, 550 Common Era. That's the frame. The agenda of the rabbis, the sages at that time, but ultimately the rabbis, was very different than the agenda of the Bible. The rabbis essentially created a new scripture, a new text. While the Bible was the word of God, the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Midrash, the Agadah became the word of God as interpreted by the rabbis. This was something my first rabbi, when I was in Rockland County, Rabbi Simon Potok, emphasized on a regular basis. We are not biblical Jews. We are rabbinic Jews. We live lives not by the Bible, but how the rabbis understood the Bible. All right. An example, again, I've used this many times. Bible says, Lo tivashel gedi b'chalei imo, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. Most of us don't really concern ourselves with the literalness of that. We just don't mix meat and milk. Okay. But that's rabbinic. That is not what the Bible says directly. And again, if you haven't heard me talk about it, this book, The Year of Living Biblically, written by a sociologist who took the Bible and tried to spend 1 year living his life literal to the literal letter of the Bible, is one of the most humorous things you're ever going to read. Okay. It is a worthwhile opportunity if you can. All right. Yes, Bob. Oh, okay. Okay. So the rabbis substituted prayer for sacrifices. They substituted the synagogue for the temple. And the priests are now out of commission. There's no place to priest. There's no place to sacrifice. And the rabbis essentially become the intellectual and spiritual leaders of the Jewish people with the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. I want to go back a little bit as well here and point out to you that the structure of life, the experience of Jewish living in First Temple times is very different than Second Temple times. It's not just they come back and recreate what existed before. This is even before biblical times, because in the time of the First Temple, they were a tribal society. By the time they come back, what is different is they've become a nation with its own diaspora, with people who are living with them outside of the land itself, people in Babylonia, people in Egypt. And so the structure upon which the rabbis will build is actually different at its very beginning from that of First Temple times. And it's important to note that. Comments, thoughts? Okay. Seeing no hands, I'll go on. The Mishnah and the Talmud, which is really the rabbinic works of the time, really are an outline, just like the Torah is an outline. It gives you generic categories. The Mishnah and the Talmud build upon that, but they also are an outline, and details need to be filled in anew as fresh problems arise in every generation. All right, life grows more complex, and so do the questions, and so do the answers. There's always, always, always a new what if. Okay, if you've ever taught a class of 7th graders and you'd say to them, don't murder, that's what the Bible says. You don't want to be in the room as they ask you 5 million what possibilities of what if. Right? Law, Sandy, I have to imagine, is exactly the same way, that you build on a precedent, but it's a new what if as you deal with issues. All right. However, what is important in this process, in the same way we operate with the Constitution, the yoke, the basis of the law remains Torah, and everything has to be related back to that original document some way. There has to be a kernel of connection, and none of the movements to this point have made a change from that. Even the Reform at this point will say their answer is the tradition or Torah has a vote, it doesn't have a veto. All right, so they still will consult it, it just doesn't have a binding impact. So Torah has that sense of power. All right. With one brief exception, during rabbinic times, Jews were subjected to foreign leaders. These leaders came in, formed their own governments, and essentially ruled over the Jews, with one exception. A period of about 70 years of self-rule from 135 before the Common Era, right after the Maccabee story, until 63 before the Common Era. It's a time in which there is suddenly self-rule, and with that is the inevitable power struggle that emerges. And what happens in that world is the development of sects, S-E-C-T-S, lots of different groups all vying for control. You read about this in the Talmud, you read about this in Josephus, you even read about it in the New Testament. There's a struggle for power, sectarianism, and much infighting during this period. And if it sounds an awful lot like the first 70 years in Israel, and as a matter of fact, it sounds like the early years of America as well. as people try to figure out who we are and who's going to have control and whose rules are going to work best. And so it's a period of great disagreement, those 70 years. 63 before the Common Era, Pompey comes along and puts an end to Jewish rulership. And the Jews end up having to now again recreate new social and religious responses. And what makes it more complicated is Jews are now all over the place. They're in Egypt, they're in Babylonia, they're making rules for things for not, it's not a centralized group of people any longer. And differences develop between communities as well as within communities. There's differences that exist now. What does happen though is that sense of chaos, by the first century of the Common Era, Rabbinic Judaism steps into that chaos and creates a dynamic religious movement, one that is not just ritual, but really is a complete orientation to all of life. They get their authority, all right, the Jewish community draws its strength from the desire of Jews, almost a sense of stubbornness, and we can do this today too, to preserve our identity and our cultural autonomy in a world in which we're always outnumbered, and is in a world in which many Jews always refuse to feel at home in that outside culture. We have this binding, we're being bound by the covenant that we entered into Sinai. And so Torah is always there for us and creates a way of life that may transcend both time and country. Ultimately, we've defined holiness from that as separation, removal. It's imitatio Dei. It's God is distinct and unique and separate. So the Jew attempts to be unique and separate and different. I'm looking for hands, not seeing any. Okay. At the same time, what is fascinating is there's a relative internal consistency of the Jewish communities, whether or not they're spread out through Asia, Africa, or Europe. And that's because they all have the same guidebook. They're all using Torah and the sanctification of Torah everywhere they are. It controls every facet of life. And essentially, I remember this from Ramal, the message we used to give the kids is every single normal behavior has the potential to be elevated to an act of holiness, to Kedusha. We eat, every human being, every animal, every being on earth eats. The Jew takes that experience and elevates it by surrounding it with blessings and appreciation. Every basic attitude, every basic activity has the potential to become Kedusha. All right? And all of that is based on the consistency across the underlying structure of Torah and Talmud. The major difference, and again, I'm not seeing any hands, the major difference from biblical to post-biblical society lays in a sense a new type of internal civil and religious leadership that governs the community. What you have during that 70-year period of self-rule is, at first, you have the Davidic dynasty, Zerubbabel's short-lived administration. He takes over as a king, but that is very quickly replaced by the high priesthood. The high priests during the Maccabean times took on a double role. They served not only as priests, but also as monarchs. They openly donned the royal purple, and all the pretensions that went with it. And this, they weren't descendants of David, and so they understood that this was not a permanent situation. But nonetheless, for the first time, they have two different, it's like the Senate and the presidency all of a sudden merging for a period of time. Right? The loss of Jewish independence, however, and the incorporation of Palestine into the Roman imperial society relegates the priests back into only their cultic role. Now that Rome has taken over the sense of ruling, the priests are out of it and they go back to their cultic role only. And what you see with this priesthood during this time, during the rabbinic period, is sort of an arc. During the 6 centuries, you have the power of the priesthood rising and rising and rising and rising until the first half of the 1st century BCE. And then it begins a downward slope until its elimination in 70 CE with the destruction of the temple. And then there's no longer any role for the priest at all. So it's created this arc that is at its apex and during those 70 years of self-rule. In addition to all the external power politics, there was one factor that accounted for the role of the priests. There's an internal metamorphosis that's going on. A new class of religious teachers are vigorously propagating their doctrine into all of life, and that's the rabbis. Essentially, there's a shift of authority that happens, and they codify, and they instruct, and they take the instruction away from the priest. It moves to the scholar, and the responsibility for ritual performance shifts from the temple and priest to synagogue and the individual. That's the shift that happens with the destruction of the temple. This rise of the rabbinic class and in the Jewish community is traceable to the disappearance of another very important group of people, and it's a necessity, and that is the prophets. Okay? In biblical times, the function of the prophet is to bring God's direct word to the people on all problems. They would find out what the issue is, go to God and get an answer, right? And then deliver it to the people. That was the role. They were messengers. That included the building of a temple, the choice of a king, the sacrificial cult, social justice, and even foreign policy. All right. However, with the arrival of Ezra, with about 150 years after the second temple was rebuilt, you have a codification and an adoption of the Torah as a law book. And so in that process, prophecy is deprived of its major reason for existence. What need is there for prophets if the revelation is now available in one book? Ezra produces and binds a book that is all-inclusive, and in such a world, prophecy actually becomes dangerous. Because if you have a Torah and there's people coming with a different message at any point, what value is the Torah? It can be changed at any point. It's superfluous. It's jeopardized by the mission of prophets. And so the rabbis declare an end to all prophecy. Now we know there's still prophets sitting on the street corners of New York, about every third corner. But the reality prophecy, as far as the rabbis were concerned, stopped with the introduction of a formal acceptance of a canonized Bible. There, again, anybody, does that make sense? Yes, Bob.
Didn't Ezra live during the time of Babylonian captivity at around 500, 400?
It's Ezra lives. There's still, again, there are a lot of Babylonian Jews. All right, but it's the second Commonwealth. It's already when a good number of Jews have come back, they've begun to rebuild the temple. Ezra comes back and insists on a whole series of Torah laws that have to be put into place, including getting rid of all intermarriage that may have happened during that time. And he institutes the reading of the Torah, but it's already after many of the Jews have come back to Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Nehemiah precedes him and he comes in afterwards. There are 5. Yes, sir, Lou.
The biblical prophets were not predictors of the future, but commenters on the current times.
That's correct. That is correct. And by the way, if that wasn't clear, Christianity has turned that on its head, because they take the descriptions of what's going on and superimpose it on events 500 years later. Okay, that it was a predictor. But for Judaism, they were commentators on the current situation and guides that brought God's word to the text, to the society. Now, there were 5 major factors that enabled the successful reconstruction of the Jewish community under the rabbinic leadership. 5. First, and unquestionably crucial, was the fact that despite the loss of life and wealth in the wars that had preceded this time against Rome, despite almost all the loss of autonomy, the community nonetheless remained intact. The Jewish population retained a control of a sizable portion of the land, and with the exception of Jerusalem, all right, most of the Israel remained under Jewish life. It may have been decimated, it may have been impoverished, but it was still Jewish in its tone and its way of living. So that's the first factor. Second, if the Jewish population provided the membership for this new society, the religious orientation was responsible for the form that it took. You had by this point, 2 centuries of Pharisaic preaching and instruction in the interpretation of Torah that had won over the masses. All right, so there was already in place a way of life. All right, you had in addition Hillel and Shammai in their schools, outstanding representatives of the 2 wings of Pharisaism, and they had become heroes. These were heroes to people. And so they represented saintliness and the study and the fulfillment of Torah. And so religious life still permeated despite Rome's presence. All right. Third is the fact there's a model for all this already. It's called the diaspora in Babylonia. How do you live under foreign rule? We have a model to turn to, was their answer. The diaspora had been removed from the temple and the priesthood. In Babylonia, they did not have any of that. Involvement was voluntary in terms of how people got involved. And so they had the advantage of a model society for them, one in which, because they were dispersed all over the place, Jews became a non-political nation. That's a new innovation. All right. The synagogue became a central component and with its communal meetings and they met in synagogues for 3 basic functions. The first 2 you'll get, I don't think you'll like the third. The first was for prayer. The second was for instruction. And the third was to discipline the members of the congregation who deviated. I would not propose that for 21st century Houston. All right. However, all right, so you've got the third is the fact that there's a model. The fourth is the sense of faith that underlies this, the personal commitment. The Jewish premise was simple. God had ordained the Torah as Israel's way of life and enjoined his children, the people of Israel, to live by it. The defeat at the hands of the Romans was definitely profound. It was palpable. It was a calamity. It was a disaster. But nonetheless, it did not spell, as the Christians proclaimed, the bankruptcy of traditional Judaism. And why not? Well, hadn't God already exiled his children and destroyed his temple once before? He subsequently restored them to it. There was again a model. We are being punished severely, but it doesn't mean we're being rejected. There's a model for this survival in place. Their responsibility, their duty was therefore clear: to make themselves worthy of divine favor by their deeds. All right. In other words, let's double down. That has been the mode of Judaism in response to disasters, to say it's our fault this has happened. Therefore, if we simply really return to our commitment, God will then reward us again. Now, that kind of theology really is a very difficult one post-Holocaust. And a lot of it has been rejected by virtually all except the Haredim. Even the modern Orthodox world no longer really accepts that theology because we don't know how to make it work with the Holocaust. It's problematic at best. All right, so that's 4. 5 The fifth reason, Roman policy of toleration, right? Jewish tradition doesn't necessarily speak kindly of Rome or its emperors, yet in retrospect of the 19th century since, Rome was not terribly vicious in the big picture. At no point did it prescribe Jewish religious behavior. No point did it bar Jewish practice, with one exception, and it's right after the Bar Kokhba revolution. It really never attempted to prohibit the Jews from congregating and pursuing their religious ways. This is in direct contrast to Antiochus of the Hanukkah story, right? Greek rulership. Rome adhered to its traditional policy of rule by law and full toleration for ancient religious traditions. So you have 5 things that enabled the rise of the success of the rabbinic attempt to recreate a Jewish culture in the world. Thoughts, comments? Okay. With the dissolution of the high priesthood, the destruction of the temple, and all the cultic authority that went with it, the people now could be only governed by Torah. The problem that remained for the rabbis to resolve was the specific ways in which Torah could be applied. In other words, they became the repositories of oral law. They had to do the interpreting. Now, what is important as well to note is that the rabbis were not given this role by revelation or by caste system. Their claim to recognition stems from the fact that they had knowledge of the Torah and the traditional interpretation of its use in the world. The rabbinate from its inception was not a caste system. It wasn't a priesthood. It was something that anybody could gain admittance if you met the standards of scholarship, and still that way today. All right, looking around. The decline, so you now have 2 Pharisaic schools that are in place at this point. You have Hillel and you have Shammai. All right, they have dissenting traditions. The decline of the Shammai group was assured by the succession of Hillel's patriarchs, beginning with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. What has happened over time is those who are followers of Shammai, they weren't necessarily in the minority, but they've been obscured deliberately through history. It's significant that if you look at later traditions, Hillel is painted as this warm and saintly personality. Shammai is cold and intemperate. To the victor go the spoils. Who gets to write history? Those who emerge victorious. Why are the priests descendants of Aaron instead of the descendants of Moses? Because the southern kingdom lasted 100 years longer than the northern kingdom. To the victor go the spoils. And so we follow mostly, with few exceptions, there are a few, the traditions of Hillel, and he gets painted as lovely and wonderful, and he's warm and delightful. All right. And this all gets codified into the Mishnah 200 in the approximately 200 CE. And at that point, once that point it is, we are descendants of Hillel. Shammai's been pushed to the side completely. All right. Okay, we're doing great. Initially, the financial resources, when there's the rabbis' rise, the financial resources of the wealthy enable them a sense of some measure of control over the rabbinic government, which emerges. In rabbinic times, they were forced to. They had to involve this group. They created what were board of 7 counselors in every Jewish municipality, and they were charged with things such as the regulation of taxes, etc. But 2 factors ultimately served to keep the wealthy at bay. One, there were crushing blows into the Palestinian Jewish community because of all that happened with Rome. And as a result, the economy crashed and the stability of the wealthy was eliminated. That's the first thing. So they're no longer wealthy. Number 2 is, no matter what, everybody was subject to the laws of Torah, no matter who they were, including the wealthy. And so you have the power of the rabbis growing as the groups that had some influence on them are being pulled away for different reasons. You no longer have a priesthood. You no longer have prophecy. You no longer have this group of wealthy merchants who also have influence. All of those factors are going away, and the power of the rabbis continues to ascend. Two institutions also become critical. One is the synagogue, and the other is the academy. All right, let's talk about those two. More than any other institution, the synagogue can be credited with having assured the continuity of Jewish religious life after the destruction of the Second Temple. Perhaps the most decisive acts of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai at that time was that he obliged the synagogues to include in their liturgy references and connections to the temple experience. Now, again, remember, they thought they would be returning in 70 years. They believed the first temple was destroyed 70 years later, the second temple. They're operating with the same premise and the same hope. And so they build in practices of the temple, shofar blowing. They build in references to, remember when we used to do this in the temple, as a way of saying we're going to reinstitute it. So you have in the traditional Musaf service, we're going to return to sacrifices. The conservative movement has changed the prayer book to say, well, remember when we used to do that. But nonetheless, it's meant to elicit, as you're having the experience of prayer, elicit the connection to previous experiences in Jewish history in the temple, very deliberately. Okay. Biblical text, personal prayer, two focal points of Jewish piety. The Torah was read when? Mondays and Thursdays, market days. It was read on Shabbat. It was read on festivals. It was read on fast days. And as a result, you could almost not get at least one exposure to Torah every single week. They put it in your face. The rabbis are saying you need to know this. And with that came sermons on Shabbat and festivals. Remember, you did not walk into a synagogue and say, I found my Eitz Chaim, here it is. Of course, it didn't exist then in this version, all right? There were no printing presses. There were no access to books and interpretations. They didn't have Zoom for a class, all right? And so how did people get access to the information? Hearing the Torah and hearing the interpretations and the homilies that were built upon it. Those were the learning opportunities. And the synagogue therefore became not only a place of prayer, but a schoolhouse. And it's why we refer to our synagogues as our shul. It's a school. We learn how to be Jewish. As for the academies, they became the centers of Torah study. And they preached that no community could be complete without it. They served as the Jewish college experience. People studied their past and adapted it to the present. So you have two institutions. And by the way, in later times, when you end up with the traditional Orthodox, and you end up with the Hasidim, each one says that, the tradition would say that, the schoolhouse takes priority, and the Hasidim would say, the synagogue takes priority. And it's always been a good battle, and may they always work together in conjunction. All right. Yes, sir. Sigmund, yes? You just need to unmute. You're muted. Sigmund, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Unmute.
There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
There's a recent book by a lady by the name of Botticelli and a guy by the name of Eckstein from Tel Aviv. It's about the economic success of our group, having to do with increased literacy. They argue that the Rabbanim passed a edict that everybody should learn how to read. And my question is, in this early synagogue movement, who were the people who read the Torah on Monday, Thursday, Saturday, and the Yom Tovim? Well, was the ability to read because everybody had to take their turn as about Torah, or were it the rabbis who read?
So there were people that they had specialists. There were people who were the Targumim who would really basically memorize the text. These are people who had a specific ability to remember. All right. And they often would read the text and translate it as they were going. And then the rabbis would interpret it. I would not suggest that in Talmudic times everybody was literate. We probably had a much greater level of literacy because of the need to study than the larger society. But to think that they were literate in the ways that we are literate, I would think not. I'm curious to know, in terms of the book that you've read, what the time frame is. That Rabbinic times or is that medieval times?
It starts after the destruction of the temple. It's
that
very
early.
vague as to where, but it's Second Temple period, especially post Jesus period.
Yeah.
The argument is that this was an agrarian society, and that in order to remain religious, you had to know about Torah. In order to know about Torah, you had to read. So the smart kid was sent to town where he was taught how to read, but teaching how to read has nothing to do with tilling the soil.
Right.
So there were people who learned how to read, and incrementally each generation that percentage increased, and the people who didn't learn how to read incrementally fell off each generation. And
that makes perfect sense.
yeah,
That makes perfect sense.
you can read that. It's Botticelli and Eckstein. It's a fascinating book.
Okay. All right. Yeah, no, it certainly makes sense. And it's one of the reasons we have academically succeeded for generations, is because of our emphasis on Torah and study. We've had to be literate. It's not some innate skill. It's the fact is we've had to be literate, and therefore it increased our opportunities in society because of that skill. Yeah, I agree.
That is their argument.
Yeah. Bob?
Yeah, that triggers in my mind the expression "Ein kamach, ein Torah, ein kamach." I'm not sure what
right.
who it's attributed to, but the agrarian society and study of Torah were linked.
Right. Ein kemach, ein Torah. Basically, if there's no bread, there's no Torah. If there's no Torah, there's no bread, meaning food. Yeah. That's the concept. We have to go hand in hand. Good.
Or wheat. Yeah.
Wheat. Well, right. In the literal sense, right. All right. What is interesting in this times, are there any other questions? Is you start to see the dominance of the Babylonian learning community over that of the Palestinian learning world. In a sense, that's actually historically proven to be advantageous because of the fact that we've been a diaspora civilization. The rules that were established in a diaspora have served us well over time. Nevertheless, Israel and its academies during this early period stayed central even to diaspora Jews who would make donations for the temple's upkeep, and they would make annual pilgrimages to Jerusalem. And so even though the learning society developed very strongly in Babylonia, the centrality of Israel remained. That said, by the 2nd century, Babylonian Jewry was the more secure Jewish community, and as a result, many Palestinian scholars sought refuge in Babylonia as they escaped the heavy hand of Rome. So you've got a movement from Palestine to Babylonia, even of the scholars. So let's talk a little bit about that Babylonian community here. At the top of the community sat a figure by the label of the Exilarch. All right. He theoretically claimed descent from the house of David, but the real source of his power laid in the authority that was given to him by the Parthian government. Okay. He conducted his court with royal protocol. He had full authority over and responsibility for civil affairs in the community. He appointed Jewish judges, Jewish tax collectors, market inspectors, and practically his power included virtually life and death over Jews within his realm. Now, officially, he also controlled religious life. All right, because for this world, ethnic and religious life went hand in hand. There was no separation. This concept of separation of church and state it certainly is not a Jewish concept in those times. All right. However, in Babylonia, what you have while he's ascended to this power is an ever-growing number of rabbinic scholars, the establishment of academies, and what you're getting created is a polarity of power within the community. Two different groups that are vying. You've got a codification of the Mishnah, the arrival of these Palestinian scholars from Israel. And so you've got a power that grows to be equal in power to that of the exilarch. And we hear in all of our texts, we hear of the tension and even open conflict between the rabbis and the exilarchs. But in the final analysis, both groups had to recognize the power of the other. Plain and simply, they were competing powers that had to be dealt with. So strong was the pride of the Jewish leaders in Babylonia, in their autonomy, in their intellectual community, that some rabbis even attributed a sanctity to the soil in Babylonia, much like one would do in Israel. With the rise of the great academies, some felt that it was forbidden to leave Babylonia, even to go back to Israel. You're now in God's promised land in Babylonia. Yeah, people say the same thing about America today. We have the two communities, Israel and America. We have this battle over who's really running things. And the answer is we both have to recognize the other and get over it. All right, that's just reality. 2 months a year, at the end of the summer and during the winter, the laity and scholars would convene at the two largest academies in Sura and Nahardya, later Pumbedita, for extensive Talmudic discussions. So you have people who are professionals, you have laity coming together, and what that does, it's very deliberate. Not only are you dispersing information, which they are, you're also creating a centrality. These become living intellectual centers and sources of law and moral teaching, and they become critical. By doing this, they become the center of Jewish life. Lou.
Was there any attempt, significant or not, for people to travel back to Jerusalem for the Chagim?
Yes. Yeah. No. They were definitely making pilgrimages. Absolutely.
Even though there was no temple.
Yes. Yeah. All right. I want to talk a little bit about Torah, tradition, and sort of shift away a little bit from the historical component to give you some other issues. There's no point in asking the following question. What does Judaism have to say about the nature of man, about sin, about the world to come, about God himself? Because like the Bible, the Talmud has incorporated within its canon lots of views on all of those topics. There isn't the answer. The Talmud, if you look at it, it is a text that says, in this, Rabbi John says this, and Rabbi Bob says that, and Rabbi Paul says this, and you go through the list. I've just made them into apostles, okay? You go through the list, and it offers you various responses to the similar question. So the question of what does Judaism say is often complex. What's really a better question to ask is, what did each of the rabbis make of one or a number of biblical statements? And what do these eclectic theologies and commentaries, what do they have in common? That's the real sense-making activity, is how do I take disparate ideas and make some sense of it in the collective? What the rabbis were bound by, however, despite borrowing from various Jewish sources, despite borrowing from challenges produced daily in their worlds, what they were bound by is that every idea had to have a connection to a biblical verse. That was a requirement. The understanding was that the Torah was the revelation of God's will, eternally relevant, eternally binding, the source of all truth and all wisdom. And the Midrashic schools of rabbinic civilization could conceive of virtually no area of life, none, that would not be ruled by the scripture. Biblical law and thought governed everything. How you conduct your business, how you relate to friends, how you behave in a bar, how do you behave in a sporting event. You pick it, there's a way to do it. Jews have a way to do it. That was the rabbinic thought. And it applied to the peasant, the businessman, the housewife, the servant, the schoolboy, the scholar. Didn't matter. It's all inclusive and it applies to everyone. This is the legal midrash or oral law. Okay. And so that's we often refer to that. That's halakha. That's how do we do. If law is the heart and body of Judaism, the second kind of midrash, agadah, or the homiletics, the sermons, the interpretations, is its lifeblood and its marrow. The Bible is not only a code of behavior, but a guide to everything in life, in everything we do. I can't emphasize that piece enough. In it, one would find a clue and a key to every form of authentic wisdom and every insight. All right, and so it's a parable of human activity, a model from which all of humanity could benefit. What you have in the Bible, you have feuds. You have feuds between Jacob and Esau, Joseph and his brothers, Moses and Pharaoh. Those come to represent eternal struggles that the Jews would confront throughout the ages. Rome became Esau, or the other way around. Esau became Rome. All right. Ishmael became the Arab world. The biblical conflicts came to represent everything in the modern world. Everything is to be found in the Bible as a source. The sun, the moon, the stars, the elements, animal life were not merely natural phenomena. They were manifestations of God's love and God's power. If you've been in the synagogue, you've heard me say a number of times, prayers like El Adon, which talk about the sun and the moon, do so very, very contextually. It is meant to, it says, the sun and moon don't rule. The sun and moon are created by God and fulfill God's desire. That prayer is a refutation of the sun and moon being God's. All right, it's God himself who sets nature and causes, as we talk about in Hamariv Aravim in the evening, the rolling of seasons and time, etc. God is in control. Nature is not a God. All right. These two forms of midrash, halakha, law, and agadah, interpretation, grow side by side. And someone in those days who was a real scholar could write a sermon that successfully wove the tapestries of both law and homiletics into one speech. Law is normative, binding, and absolute. On the other hand, the homily is subjective and without binding force. That's an important distinction. Legal statements theoretically derive from formulation in the Bible, and there's only one possible meaning, theoretically. We know that that doesn't play out. However, it should all be able to be harmonized. In contrast, the Agadah doesn't even make that attempt. All right, I might say something on verse 1 in chapter 14. Another person might say something on chapter 15 in the next verse, and next verse. It has nothing to do with what I just said. That was not a problem in homiletics. We could even contradict each other. That is not a problem. In law, it does have to come together. In homiletics, it does not. Okay? Thus, Rabbinic Judaism, despite being the oldest organized religion in Western civilization, never came up with a systematic theology. Ways to think, because you could offer so many different ways. The Talmud, where it does offer anything, states it in the negative. What's outside of our bounds? So, for example, in the Mishnah, you'll find the following. The following have no share in the world to come. He who denies resurrection, he who denies the divine origin of the Torah, and the Epicurean. So it can tell you who's outside of our bounds, but it doesn't necessarily tell you what you need to believe. Judaism is not a faith. There's very little dogma. The only thing I can think of is Shema, one God. When we talk about faiths in America, Judaism doesn't fit into a nice little category like that. It's distinct. Comments, thoughts? Okay. Yes, Bob.
But even though there isn't a set theology, there is a set process of interpreting Torah, of Talmud, in terms of developing how we interpret activities and what we should do and what we shouldn't do.
Give me an example of what you're saying so I understand.
Well, for instance, going back to medical bioethics in Judaism,
Mhm.
the sanctity of human life, not shedding the blood of your neighbor or watching shedding of blood. Yet as you go forward through the centuries and the responsement that have developed from Talmud and beyond, there are different interpretations on how you can deal with that. It's an evolving dynamic law, not a fixed law.
But that, I think you just hit on the key element of what you said. It's the laws. The laws are actions, maybe built on a principle, but it's our actions that are critical. It's not the underlying principles. The Jews' answer to a broken world is in his response, is his physical actions. What one's worth in life is not what one believes, but what one does. And that, in a sense, I understand they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. I understand, which is, I think, what you're trying to say. All right. But there still is a strong emphasis within Judaism upon the actions, that what you think matters less than your actions. At the end of the day, I may feel that giving to the poor is important, but if I don't do it, then I'm guilty of not doing tzedek, of not doing the righteous act. And that's really the focus. All right. Whereas that's not necessarily the same in other religions. We are much more action-based. And in so doing, since that's the case, anybody can enter the covenant by opting to behave in certain ways, and all ethnicity also becomes irrelevant at that point. Judaism opened its doors to anyone willing to take on those behaviors. That's what conversion. It's taking on Judaism's sense of Torah. And the idea of chosenness, for example, all right, you have to choose to be chosen. Anybody can choose to be chosen. You take on these responsibilities, you opt in. You're not chosen by birth. If you ignore all the laws of Judaism, that's not chosenness. We like to call it that way when we can feel comfortable. It doesn't mean you're not a Jew. All right. But the sense of chosenness implies something far beyond that. Being a Jew is just a baseline. Chosenness is yet a step above. I want to finish up with one last comment. And that is that this idea that Jews do not seek converts, all right, we don't encourage conversion, has been a false notion. In the time of the rabbis, the Talmudic literature provides records of a lot of pride of the actions of those who are distinguished converts. The reason, and you look back in that time and you will see a heated competition between Jews and Christians for converts in the time. The reason today that we do not see converts is in the early Middle Ages, Christianity basically said, if somebody converts to Judaism, we will not only kill the convert, we will kill the person who did the conversion. Now that could serve as a deterrent. And it changed Jewish thinking for 1,000 years. And there's a lot of articles out there today that say it's time. If you believe you have something of worth, you're not going to force it on anybody, but go sell it. That's what good, well-intending Christians, when they come to you and they try to convert you, they're not evil. They believe they've got this wonderful message that they want to share. Why shouldn't we do the same? Okay. That's my last note on this for today. I will take any questions or comments. So next week, we will do look at overriding themes of the rabbis, which is kind of what Bob was hinting at. There are some larger picture values that are at play, for sure. And then we'll talk about the process of canonization of the Tanakh. How we came to determine what's in, what's out, and what are the thoughts included. Okay? Yes, sir. Sigmund. You need to unmute again. We can't hear you. Yeah.
Can you provide us with your outline of the talk?
It will be, yeah, you got today's, right?
Yes.
It'll be available, should be available online. For the members, it'll,
It's
for
available
members,
online already, Rabbi.
it may have already been there, yeah. All right, but if not, it'll show up again, and in the weekly email that comes out to the synagogue members as well, you have the links there. So it's either online or there. The whole course has already been written, so it's all available. This time we didn't do a lot of reading. Next time we won't. We'll do it. There's a lot more text readings that will come in as we go along. The introductory sessions are a little different.
Thank you.
It's good to see everybody. Thank you for
Thank you.
joining us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat Shabbat Shalom.